QSO Today, episode 246, Jack Worth, WA0QZK. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur. They are excited to announce the new IC9700 VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz all-mode transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, Hans Summers, G0UPL's kit company, and creators of many fine radio kits, including the popular QCX transceiver kit. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Both ICOM and QRP Labs will be at the Dayton Hamvention this May. Links to both are in this week's show notes page. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, WA0QZK, your host. I'm so grateful for your messages and emails, especially your comments and criticisms. They help me to make a better podcast. I also appreciate your guest recommendations. One of these recommendations is my guest today, Jack Worth, WA0QZK. Jack is a retired pastor living in Warsaw, Indiana. Jack is a collector of bugs and telegraph keys. He was kind enough to send me pictures of his collection that I put in this week's show notes page. Be sure to go to the show notes page so that you can enjoy his collection residing in the Warsaw Telegraph Office. More on that in this QSO Today with WA0QZK. WA0QZK, this is Eric, WA0QZK. Are you there, Jack?
Yes, good afternoon from the Warsaw Wireless Telegraph Office in Warsaw, Indiana. It's Jack here.
Jack, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Before we start at the beginning of your ham radio story, why don't you explain what you mean by the Warsaw Telegraph Office? What does that mean exactly?
Well, it's kind of like looking back into the past where telegraph offices were part of the community and you went and sent messages and so forth. And on my 70th birthday, my wife bought me a log cabin, and she said, "This is your birthday present for the rest of your life." And I was so delighted it was a real log cabin, and I wired the thing and put it all together. And I thought, it ought to have a name. And so a friend of mine painted me a sign that said Warsaw Wireless Telegraph Office, and that's hangs on my front porch.
So the Warsaw Wireless Telegraph Office is your ham shack.
That's exactly right. I get all kinds of mail offers for credit cards, offers to help me hire personnel and so forth. It's kind of fun. I've got calendars printed and ink pens printed and so forth.
Do you have the what are the ink guards for your forearms and the visor?
I have the visor.
Oh, you have the visor.
Yeah, the green plastic visor.
Well, that's very cool. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it started for me when I was a little kid because my dad worked on the railroad as a bridge carpenter, and he got hurt and put out of a job. They said he'd never work again, so he began to study from Sprayberry Radio Academy and learned how to fix radios and started a shop. And for Christmas, right around the time I was probably 4 or 5 years old, he bought me a little kit for a crystal set. And he did most of the wrapping of the coil and everything else, of course. And, a little thing like that plants a seed in your mind, and it never quite goes away. And that's where my interest in radio started, and all the smells of him soldering and the beeswax on the capacitors back in the 40s and so forth. It just kind of intrigued me. And so all of my life I've been interested in radios. When I was in high school, people would give me, and grade school, people would give me their old radios, and I'd come home and tinker them up and listen to shortwave and put up antennas all over the house, much to my father's consternation. And that's kind of where it started. I really wanted to kind of look into ham radio. I'd heard about it. So one of my teachers at high school, I asked him about ham radio, and he says, somebody else will tell you. He had a license once and abused it and lost it, and he was bitter about it. But anyway, I always was interested in radio and tubes and intrigued by it. I built crystal radios and run antennas up on kites and all kinds of things just to...
So when did you get your first license?
I was pastoring a little church in Edna, Kansas, and there was a ham radio club in Coffeyville, Kansas, and the fellows were quite interesting, and I was interested, and they kind of mentored me a little bit. One fellow named Jerry Clare was I don't know if I can remember what it's called, but anyway, he loaned me some stuff and loaned me a little 2-meter super regenerative, and I built antennas for it. And actually, in '67, I got my novice license, and somebody loaned me an Amico AC1, and with that and a Hallicrafter S41G, I made my first CW contact. I didn't know I was QRP. I think he put out 5 to 7 watts, I think, and just a piece of wire out the window. That's where it all started.
Oh, that's pretty amazing. So you got your novice in 1967. Do you mind saying how old you were then?
I would have been 26, and then sometime in that year or the beginning of the next, I thought, I want to have a technician, so I studied and got that. And then of course, to take your test, you had to go to Kansas City to get, and that's where I went for my general. And so I got the technician, and then I studied, and I got up to most of 20 and all of 16 words a minute, so I'd know I'd passed the code test. And I drove to Kansas City, the FCC, and took my exam. It was kind of a funny thing because they give you the questions to answer, and you had to pass the code test. I think maybe that was first. And so I passed the code test, and then the answers for all the questions for the general, the guy laid a template over it, and nothing matched. And he said, oops, wrong one, and he put the right one on there, and I passed that. So he was messing with me. And,
do you still have the Amico AC1?
I wish I did. I'd almost pay $200 for another one, but I later built a 1960, and I used that as the first one I had put together myself. And then my wife bought me a NC300, great big boat anchor, and we had a lot of fun with that.
Well, I think you'd be pleased to know I just heard on Ham Nation, which is another podcast, that there's a company called the New Amico, and they're producing the AC1 kit.
Oh, are they?
Right. So you can identical to the original.
What's it cost?
$249, I think. It's interesting. It's only $20 more for it assembled, which is pretty astounding. It says all Russian parts, so they must be getting tube sockets and tubes from Russia. Yeah,
Svetlana is probably making their tube for them.
Maybe sure, but apparently they also have. And we're having this conversation, but the listeners are listening in. They're also selling transformers and other parts and stuff as well. So you don't have to buy just the AC1. You can also buy from their parts catalog. So it's a very interesting idea for people that are waxing nostalgic about the Amico AC1. It's called newamico.com is where I saw it the other night.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, pretty cool. Huh. Was WA0QZK the call sign that you were given when you upgraded to technician?
My first call sign was WN0QZK, and then for the technician it was WA0QZK, and the same for the general. And then when I moved to Indiana back in '72, I got WB9LAJ. In the middle of that, I moved across the line into Oklahoma, and I was WB5DIG. And so when we got up here and the vanity calls came around, I could set up my key and send that WA0QZK almost without thinking about it. So I got it back, and that's my call forever now.
Oh, that's pretty amazing.
You know, when I got to, in the middle of all of that, I went from, when I left home to go to Bible college, I went to Kansas City, and they were cleaning out some old buildings, and they gave me the guts out of a Stromberg Carlson shortwave radio record player thing, and I took the guts home in the speaker and threw the wire out the window, and I tuned in on a guy sending CW, which I'd been struggling to learn, and I copied the first message in CW I ever copied, and that was, "It is snowing." And I felt like I was floating away.
Usually I ask the question here whether ham radio and electronics played a part in the choices that you made for your career in education, but it sounded to me, because you've already mentioned a couple times, that maybe it didn't?
Not really. It didn't. It was the thing I just liked to do, and a thing I longed to do and wanted to do, and it was just in me, and I had to do it. And it's like playing an accordion. I could almost play it before I got one because I wanted to do it so bad.
Did amateur radio, has it played a part in your career? I mean, did you spend some time abroad, perhaps, and used amateur radio to talk home? Or have you always been in North America?
I didn't do anything like that. The only thing about amateur radio that really had much to do with my career was the fact that the more things you know about, the better pastor and preacher you can be, because you've got a background of knowledge and most of it fits into what you're talking about.
Well, that makes sense. And now this message from ICOM America. Create your own band opening. ICOM's newest SDR transceiver, the IC9700, is coming soon. This new VHF, UHF, and 1.2 GHz all-mode transceiver brings ICOM's direct sampling to the VHF, UHF weak signal world. This radio really has me excited by the possibilities of being able to operate moon bounce or meteor scatter, or with some additional components, the ES-HALE-2 geosynchronous satellite. The IC9700 has the same form factor as the IC7300 and will certainly complement your existing HF radios. The IC9700 all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features such as dedicated amateur satellite operation, color touchscreen, built-in D-Star capability, RF direct sampling on the VHF and UHF bands, dual independent receivers capable of full duplex operation, as well as Dual Watch, ICOM's feature to allow you to listen in two places at the same time. Output power on the IC9700 is 100 watts on 2 meters, 75 on 70 centimeters, and 10 watts on 1.2 gigahertz. If you're going to the Dayton Hamvention this May, be sure to stop at the ICOM booth in Building 2 to see the new IC9700 and ICOM's complete line of amateur radio transceivers for every band and every ham radio operator. You can become one of the lucky winners to take home some limited edition swag kits by visiting ICOM's website to enter the drawing by clicking on the IC9700 image in this week's show notes page. I'm grateful to have ICOM as a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast and appreciate their support. And when you buy your ICOM 9700 or any other fine ICOM product, be sure to tell your ICOM dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. What's your current rig?
Right now, the one I use almost all the time is an MFJ 9040 that I got 14 years ago in a box of junk. I gave $30 for this box of junk. It had wires, and I didn't know what it all was, and I brought it back over here to the house, and I pulled this little rig out, and there was a folded dipole antenna in the mix that somebody had messed with and wouldn't load up. So anyway, I messed around with this thing and got that antenna fixed and put it up out here in the yard, and a telegraph key, and that little old 5-watt unit, I have talked everywhere on that thing. Took it to Alaska with me. When we go on long trips, if I can at all, I take it along in a suitcase with a battery, a key, and a piece of wire, and a logbook, and off we go.
I'll put a link to it in the show notes page so that people can see what. But I have to tell you, in 246 interviews, I've never spoken to a single QSO Today guest who has an MFJ 9040. Well, what is the MFJ 9040?
Well, it's the MFJ. Some people call it mighty fine junk. It's kind of an insult, but it's just a little transceiver, very simple. Has a volume control, it has a frequency control and an RIT, and it's got, along with it, a portable tuner. And that little portable tuner, you can take almost any piece of wire and throw it up in a tree and load that thing up and talk to people.
And is it a single band transceiver, or is it a multi-band transceiver?
It is. It's a single band. I have other transceivers here. I got a Elecraft KX1 that has all kinds of bands on it, and it's so complicated. And I also, the main rig in the shack here that I don't use all that much is an ICOM 706 MKG2. It's 100-watt output, and all this stuff is hooked together with multiple switches. I have a solar panel outside and a battery, and I don't have to worry about the grid. I just turn my radio on, and the power's there. And
so you're implying from from the rigs that you're pointing out that you're mostly a QRP operator?
Well, I operate QRP most of the time because 5 watts seems to get through about as good as 100. And I have an array of telegraph keys on the operating desk here in front of me. One's a CW paddle, and I have a German Junker, excellent key, and a Vibroplex deluxe model. And then last summer in an antique store, I picked up an old solid brass spark key and got it for $23 and put it together the right way, and that's a delight to use. But I do mostly CW. The FM for local, the emergency net and so forth, but most of what I do, I just turn on my little 5-watt rig and go for it.
And what do you like to work on your 5-watt rig? Now, you're operating 40 meters, so do you have a time and or schedules that you like to do on 40 meters? Are you a ragchewer?
I'm a ragchewer. I'll answer guys that want SKCC numbers, and I'll give them mine, which, by the way, is 1776 with a C after it. I don't know how I got lucky to get that number, but I did. And but I like to sit here and chat with a guy for 45 minutes or an hour if he wants to do it, or just give him a number and say thank you, and so to send out QSO cards and get QSO cards and so forth.
What speed do you like to ragchew?
Oh, I just ease along at about 13 to 15. I can copy faster than that if the guy's good.
Do you copy in your head?
I'm learning to do that. It's not really, I have to really concentrate, because if it's a word with 5 or 6 or 7 letters in it, I almost forget what the first one was by the time I get to the end. By the way, I am 78 years old this July. Been a ham now since 1967 when I got my first license in Edna, Kansas.
Over 50 years. 52 years.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Well, that's pretty cool. Were you always a CW operator? I mean, you started as a novice, but did you go through the single sideband and all that stuff?
I never got really enthused about single sideband. I've got a big portfolio full of QSL cards from all over the world that I got working CW with helping hands in the middle of the night. There's a Triple H net, they call it, I used to connect up with. And that was fun, and I thought it was important. But when I think ham radio, I think get your telegraph key and talk to somebody. That's what it's about.
What kind of antennas do you have on the Warsaw Telegraph Office?
The main antenna is a G5RV that I've kind of altered. It's instead of 102 foot across the top, it's 130 foot. And I seem to get really good response from people on the other end with my 5 watts. I get a lot of 579s and a lot of 599s, and sometimes I'll be working a guy that's running 600 watts, and I can barely hear him, and he's hearing me. So that's the main one. I have a 6-meter vertical and a J-pole for 6 meters and 2 and 440, which I'm capable of working, but I only operate on those on the 2-meter and 440 for local net stuff. I don't make a hobby out of that. I'm a CW guy.
Right. Now, the ICOM 706, are you using that on VHF and UHF?
Well, I use it on 2 meters. When they call a net, I use that, and sometimes I use a handy talkie, but that's basically what I use that for. And I'm just retired from being pastor of a church here in Warsaw for 20 years, and I'm having some time to get out here and read how to program these things and you know what's in them and a whole bunch of stuff that I just before I had sermon preparation and calling on people and so forth hanging over my head all the time, and I didn't get a lot of the stuff done that I wanted to do. And
do you find that in retirement that you're busier now than you've ever been?
No.
Oh, that's refreshing.
I'm just busy as I want to be. You see, for 20 years, I've had sermons to prepare every week, and for quite a while, it was Wednesday night and Sunday morning and Sunday evening, and then later on it dropped to Sunday morning and Sunday evening, and then later it was Sunday morning because the people in the church were getting old and it was hard to drive at night, and people have their own schedules and so forth. And so the workload was kind of dropping off a little bit. But now I come out here, and if I want to read a Hebrew text or Greek, or just read a book for my own pleasure, I can, but I can also pick up a manual for one of my radios, and I can be serious enough now to find out how to really run the thing.
Do you have an amateur radio workbench?
Yes, I do. It used to be a cot, and I built it myself and had piano legs on it, and I had them low enough that I put a cushion on top and I could take a nap. But I don't nap out here except in my recliner. So I put longer legs on it, and now I got a nice place to put stuff together and take stuff apart and so forth.
What project do you have on your workbench now?
I've been fixed a cuckoo clock for a lady, but right now I have a power supply out of a computer, and that pretty little square box looks to me like something I could build a little Amico transmitter in or something like that.
You probably could, actually.
Yeah, I'm looking at something right now that would interest you. I have a collection of more than 60 telegraph keys, all the way from the 1850s on up to 1960s, and I have a large oak case with beveled glass and glass shelves in it, and all those are arrayed in there. Every one of them, when I found it, I'd bring it home and clean it up and put it on the air, and then I'd put it over my case, and then I'd find another one.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. Which one of your telegraph keys do you think is the most unique?
On my QSL card, I have a 1909 Micograph, and that was one of the first, like Vibroplex, only the handle comes out, the paddle comes out the side instead of the end. And so that was given to me by a railroad museum for setting them up a landline telegraph that the kids could come in and work with, and they gave me this telegraph key, and I cleaned it up, and it was beautiful. I also have a 1918 Model X, the early model with the square pendulum staff Vibroplex key, and it's the one that came out that has only one set of points instead of two. I found that in Carmel, Indiana one day in an antique shop and bought it and brought it home.
What do you think is the most valuable key that you have?
That 1918 Vibroplex Model X, I think, probably is the most valuable.
Now, with a collection of 60 telegraph keys, does that mean that you have all of the Vibroplex models?
No. I have a key from a guy who lived in England. I have what's called a legged key, like they used to put in a depot with. You couldn't tell any wire coming to this telegraph key because they come up underneath of it and hooked up from below the desktop. And then I have the Lionel keys that the government asked Lionel to make telegraph keys instead of little choo-choo trains during World War II. They actually made a Model 36 Vibroplex, but they put Lionel on it, and they're an excellent key. I have Brown Brothers, one of their keys, very excellent key. A couple of these Juncker keys that from Germany, World War II, that has a clip that goes over your leg. So if you're in a Jeep or an airplane and no table, you don't have to have one. You just clip that thing to your leg. There's a couple of keys over there, like was on the Titanic, that Kent put out here a few years ago. I have an original Vibroplex, the 1904 that they first came out with. I have a reproduction of that they put out in 2004, which is a beautiful key. And, I could go on and on, but There's a bunch of them over there.
Now, all of them are operational?
Yes.
And do you operate them? Do you kind of rotate them through your operating position?
When I found them, I brought them into my ham shack, and if they needed cleaned a little bit, I cleaned them up, and I made sure that the wiring was all okay, and I hooked them up to my transmitter, and I made at least one contact before I put it over there in the case.
That's very cool. Do you have any test equipment on your workbench?
Yes, I have a couple of tube testers, and I have an antenna analyzer, and I don't know, soldering irons.
Enough to get the job done.
Several voltmeters in here. Yeah. I see right now the sun has fully charged my deep cycle marine battery over here, and the lights are green on the control thing, so I'm ready to go.
Uh-huh. How much solar power do you generate? Are you just charging one deep cycle battery?
I'm just charging one deep cycle battery, and I've only time I ever had it kind of go downhill. The battery's been in here for almost 7 or 8 years. I'm sure it needs replaced. And last week I was running my 100-watt unit, and after I was on for about an hour, all of a sudden my battery booster began to whistle at me, let me know that the battery was kind of tapped out.
Now, you mentioned earlier that your the Straight Key Century Club, your ID number is 1776C. Is it what you said?
Yes.
What is the Straight Key Century Club? And what does it mean to be a centurion?
Well, it means you've contacted a certain number of people.
Who are members?
Yeah. And you submit their calls and their numbers, and if you get enough of them, then you get this designation, and you can go ahead and become a tribune, and there's a C and a T and an S, and I don't really work at that stuff, but it just so happened that I happened to contact enough people that I qualified for that. And they're an organization to promote the use of CW, which, by the way, is still the second most popular form of communication in ham radio, and with a little bit of power goes a really long way.
No, we seem to, for some reason, and it's possible because of the age of the people that I interview, the majority, I think, are CW operators or still have an affinity for CW because they started as novices with CW.
Yeah, Jay Leno had a program. Did you see it?
He did, as a matter of fact.
Was that not awesome?
It was awesome. Because obviously, I think if you're using a Morse code key, it's faster than using your two thumbs, right, on your on the touch screen of your smartphone.
Yeah, and once you get onto it, it just flows like talking to somebody.
Are you a member of an amateur radio club out there in Warsaw?
I'm a member. I'm a treasurer for the last 25 or so years of the Hoosier Lakes Amateur Radio Club in Warsaw, Indiana. We usually have 30-some people show up for meetings.
And of those people, do you see any new hams there?
Oh, yeah. Yes, we're having some younger hams, and in the last 3 or 4 years, we have had classes, and we've licensed about 200 people in this area, because the city has realized that their people need to get a ham license, because when we really have something bad go wrong, their equipment doesn't work and ours does.
Now, are those 200 licensees, are they active?
Probably most of them aren't, but I don't know, because I don't see all of them at the club meetings, and I don't collect dues from all of them. All I know is that because a lot were city employees and others were just regular people, they've come to our classes, and they've studied, and they've got a technician license, and some of them we just had some new generals and then some extra classes come on. We've got the people who they're called VE. They are able to give the exams to these people and so forth.
What do you think it would take to get those people who have licenses who've taken the tests, and maybe they took them because they're city workers, for example. What do you think it would take to kind of bring them in and help build the club numbers?
Well, I'll tell you what. Sometimes hard times cause people to think about what possibilities they have. And things are too easy right now, and so they've got their license, and now they're doing something else, and the license has kind of faded into the background. But that's one thing. It's pretty hard to motivate people to play the piano if they have no interest. But if there's an interest in doing something and there's a need for it that's obvious, if they have the qualifications, they'll come out of the woodwork.
Does the Hoosier Lakes Amateur Radio Club have an active ARES or emergency services group?
Yes. Yes.
And what kind of activities are they doing?
Oh, when there's marathon runs, and sometimes the powers that be set up a situation where not something literally happened, but what if something happened? We did a thing here some time back where they said, okay, there was this truck parked and it was full of some kind of nasty substance, and some kids came and opened the valves and got it on them, and now they're at home and they can't hardly breathe and they got problems and so forth. So they set up a scenario, and we sent people out to the site. We had people in our city-provided radio room, and also I was a liaison over at the hotel, and we communicated back and forth and let the people at I said hotel, I meant hospital. We let the people at the hospital know there were a certain amount of ambulances coming with a certain amount of people, so they could get ready for the need that was there and so forth. So we worked that, and they were amazed at how well we could communicate.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. I wanted to go back to the Hoosier Lakes Amateur Radio Club for a moment. You mentioned that you've been the treasurer of the club for 20 years?
Oh, 25 or so.
Why take a leadership role in an amateur radio club?
Well, if you're going to be part of something like a family, you don't just go off and do your own thing all the time. At least I don't. For quite a few years, I had the field days out here in the back of my property. There's a campground out here and so forth, and just being part of the club and pitching in and doing the best you can. It's like being a good church member. You don't just sit there and soak and sour and wait till they have to squeeze you like a sponge to get anything else out of you. It's just fun being part of something that's meaningful. And so when the former treasurer very suddenly passed away, they asked me, would you like to do this? They thought I probably knew a lot about it because my wife runs the Worth Financial Service here in Warsaw and does income taxes for people, and they thought I was just a natural choice, I guess. And so I've kept track of their finances for all these years.
Well, you must have an affinity for it if you've been doing it for that long. I was going to say that the treasurer seems to be probably one of the most busy jobs in a club, wouldn't you think?
Well, it gets busy as you want to make it. I mean, I collect the dues, and when we have our banquet, I collect the money for it, and I write the checks for the repeater. We send our repeater operator here in town a check every year to help him with his expenses and so forth. It doesn't take much time. My goodness, I wouldn't spend an hour a week on it probably. It's not that complicated.
Well, I think that's amazing. Maybe what we're doing is just too complicated. How about that?
Well, it's like my solar system. I have read people have all kinds of solar-powered systems for their ham shack and so forth. Well, some years ago, a guy named Jim Townsend came to a club meeting with a solar panel about 20 inches by 24, something like that, on a cart with a couple of batteries that were dead, and wanted to sell it to the club. They wouldn't even pay attention to him, so I said, "Hey, what do you take for it?" And he told me. I said, "You got it." So I brought it home, cleaned it up, put a new battery on it, used it for 10 or 15 years, and finally the controller played out. So I made a phone call to what I thought was a friend of mine, and it changed his number, and it was the guy that sold controllers. So for $25, I got her back in gear, and it sat out there in my cabin, nothing complicated. A couple of volt-ohm meters tell me what's coming in and what's going out to my radio and so forth. And it's very simple, and it just works,
It's a charge controller that you're using, right?
Uh-huh.
And what kind of charge controller are you using?
It's a black one. I can't tell you the name on it. It's been so long since I put it on the cabin wall, but the other one was outside on the cart, and water got to it. So I just put a receptacle on the cart where the solar panel is, and run it across under the grass over to the cabin, and brought it in and hooked up the controller inside, and I haven't had any problem with it since.
Now, some people complain that these charge controllers generate a radio hash in the HF bands. Has that ever been a problem for you?
No. The only thing that caused any hash in the radio band is my fluorescent tubes up on top of my cabin. They sound like background noise. And but when I'm operating CW and the guy's hard to hear, I turn on the lamp above the rig and switch off the ceiling lights, and all the noise goes away.
Now, the Hoosier Lakes Amateur Radio Club also looks like they have a list of traffic nets on their website. Do you participate in traffic nets?
Yeah, we have every Wednesday night at 7:00. We have an emergency net, and we report in. And if we have any traffic, we'll pass it on, and somebody will, take it and call the person, contact the person, and pass it on. And during Katrina, we had some stuff that came through here all the way from down there where the hurricane was, and some people trapped in the attic of a house, and they got into Plymouth, Indiana, and Plymouth got into us, and we were able to communicate for those people down there in the hurricane.
Do you have any favorite out-of-shack ham radio activities?
Oh, yes. Give me my little MFJ 9040, my little suitcase I got made up, and I'll go out and sit out here in the backyard, or go sit in a cemetery and throw a wire up in a tree, or just, it's just fun to be away from home and have your little rig that you can set up, and it's kind of like, why would anybody go outside to eat? Well, it's called a picnic, and it's funner than eating in the house. And that's the same way with your radio. And in the middle of the winter, I've gone out back to a picnic table out in the campground and sat out there in the snow and operated my little rig. It's just fun.
And the noise floor is much lower than if you're in the house.
Well, I don't have it. I got a station here in the house, and I got one out in the cabin. And in the house, I don't have a problem with the lights in the house. I don't have that many fluorescent lights in the house. At least they don't bother it. But and I got both buildings have a G5RV above the house, and I just they're an amazing antenna. I've operated all at Paris, France, with 3 watts on a G5RV.
That's pretty amazing. Now, you mentioned when we first started, you spoke to me in Hebrew a little bit, so it's my understanding that you're a Hebrew reader. Have you been to Israel?
I have been to Israel. Had a lot of fun over there. I don't know a lot of Hebrew. What I took was biblical Hebrew, and you're not supposed to be able to talk that. You just read it and understand it, hopefully. But I got some Berlitz tapes, and when I went to Israel, here's a guy with a stand selling orange juice, and I could walk over and say, "Mitz tapuzim, kamazeole, how much is it?" And efo hashivatim.
Where's the bathroom, right?
Yes. That's important.
That's an important one to know. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you take the MFJ? Did you try to do...
I didn't take it to Israel. I thought there'd be complications to that, and I didn't have time enough or take time enough to figure out what I had to do to operate there to have a proper license. It came up, and we got into a group that was going, and it was a delight, and I was totally consumed by going to Israel and all the things I saw and heard.
Well, I'm going to put a link to the Israel Amateur Radio Club in the show notes, and there is a link on their website to say how you can bring radios to Israel so that you can operate them here. It's actually very easy. And I hope that when you come back that you'll actually bring a radio, or we'll supply you with one so you can operate from here.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah. I'm glad you understood my Hebrew.
Well, you know what? It sounds almost like mine. So, Jack, what do you think is the biggest challenge to amateur radio now?
Oh, I think it's out there and nobody sees it. There are people trying to ruin our country. And if they ever do the things they want to do to America, I can just see that there's going to be all kinds of repercussions, and one of them might be, a totalitarian government, if it establishes itself, gets afraid of its people. And I've talked to guys over in Chechnya and other places, trying to think of the CW club I joined over there, where for years and years their totalitarian government was afraid to let them operate their radios, and they finally got it back. Politics is one of the biggest threats to ham radio, and that's political, I guess. I don't know if that's...
Well, during World War II, the ham radio service was suspended, for the duration of the war.
They were afraid that spies would get it and use it, and they might have, but they didn't. Once they get it, they don't want to give it back. And so thank the Lord for people like HPM and other people later on who got our privileges reestablished. Yeah.
Well, I'm always suspicious of ham radio operators, and I guess I'm saying this on the QSO Today podcast, from countries that are ruled by totalitarians, and that's because the only people that have licenses to operate amateur radio are people who are part of that establishment.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What do you think is the biggest opportunity in amateur radio now?
Well, I don't know. It's probably the same as it's always been. It's an opportunity for a person to have an experience that's fulfilling and fun and useful to his community. And I know there are a lot of things out there that don't really get my attention, because I think I've gotten kind of lazy and I like to do what I like to do. But there's a lot of people who are very energetic in their outlook, and there's all these nodes. I don't understand exactly how they work, and there's other ways that you can, with a little thing in your hand, you can talk to somebody in Israel. You don't need a telephone line or anything. There's computer-driven programs that you actually can use very, very, very small amounts of power, and that computer can sort it out of the mud and you can communicate. I think those things are kind of exciting, really. If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it sure does. We actually do that here. We're talking perhaps about hot spots. You can use your portable to talk to a hot spot that's connected over the internet to other hot spots around the world. That's kind of interesting technology. There are some people that might say that's not amateur radio, but I think just the fact that we, develop that kind of stuff makes it amateur radio.
That's true, and I'm one of them who say, well, that doesn't really seem like ham radio. But then again, I'll tell you, our people have been at the forefront of so many things. Some years ago, I saw a picture. It was 1923 that this guy had an Areola Junior radio, an old guy with a beard and his Brandis Superior earphones on, and the caption said, listening to church services because it was too snowy to get out to church, and so forth, and that picture intrigued me. So it was in the World Book Encyclopedia, and I went to Field Enterprises Educational Corporation in Chicago and I said, I would like to have a copy of that picture. They said, we can't sell it to you, we can't give it to you because it belongs to Westinghouse. So I got a hold of Westinghouse, and they said, oh, yeah. they sent me a whole big stack of papers with pictures, glossy pictures, 8x11s of their operations through the years. Their first station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, KDKA, and it was on the second or third floor of a building, had 100 watts. You could hear them 20 miles away on a crystal set. And that one of the guys that was responsible for the invention of the kinescope tube and television, over which in 1927 they broadcast the first baseball game. This guy was a ham radio operator who put this thing together and made it work, and the kinescope tube was vertical in the receiver with a mirror at 45 degrees so that you could sit back and look at it through that mirror. Intriguing stuff, and ham guys are right in the middle of that.
Yeah, isn't that cool?
It is amazing.
Yeah, no, I think...
I still got that big bunch of pictures and stuff, and I've read it over and over.
Well, that's why this is such a great fraternity, is because so many hams that we get together with are so interested in doing many different things that support the hobby, not just, one thing. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Would you have any advice that you'd give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Enjoy yourself. That's what it's for. So...
Anyway, Jack, you've been a great guest, and I really appreciate your coming on and taking the time to talk about amateur radio in Warsaw, Indiana, and how amateur radio has affected your life. So with that, I want to wish you 73, and thank you so much.
Okay, and Eric, I am very pleased to have had a chance to catch up with you and talk with you.
73.
73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Jack. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed, including pictures of his bugs and telegraph keys. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in WA0QZK in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.